Hi everyone, I'm here to do the next installment of the Major Arcana series. Today we're going to be talking about Lust, number 11. Um, this is one of those cards that has a lot to it, so I'm going to try to address the parts of it that are particularly important that I've come up with um, by reading and kind of just meditating on this stuff. But it is because it's taken as one of the prime symbols of the, I guess, Crowleyan philosophy and mindset. I think there's a lot to it, but it's also taken in some directions that I don't necessarily think are right. First of all, I would like to say that I am in a state of complete shock, sort of shock, but um, a state of grief over the passing of Whitney Houston. As an aside, we have lost another in way too short time, another incredible voice. So that's definitely on my mind today. And I was absolutely just stunned when I found out last night. Um, so as one of my few favorite pop artists, I'm sort of bereft. But anywho, so right. Well, anywho, getting back to this card, I think this card is interesting. Speaking of Whitney Houston, because of course, someone who dealt with the problems of addiction and drug use, and I think this card can sometimes be seen as. I think a lot of people see it as a license for saying that sort of behavior is okay, um, and that there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. I don't think that's right, and I think that's one of the big areas where Crowley went wrong. I think Crowley, because of his own addictions to various drugs, really took the statement in the Book of the Law, therefore to worship me take strange drugs, and that Hadith says in Book 2 or Chapter 2, um, where he's basically giving people free license to do whatever because there is no hell hereafter. There is only the dissolution and kisses of new or whatever he says. I haven't read it again in a while. Um, but I think when we take that too literally, we immediately set ourselves up for disaster because then it makes it seem this is how Thelema gets the very bad rap of being just hedonism without any restriction. And we have to um, I think we have to agree that that's not necessarily what's going on here, because there are also statements, be thou not animal, refine thy rapture. Um, pleasure should not be base. I think the idea of the first statement is that, you know, you are not going to be, the emphasis of it is that you are not going to be punished by a God who has some sort of moral issue against, drugs. um, that's not how it works. God's morality is, if we can even say that God has any morality, is not so myopic. Um, so that's important. And also, it prevents us from creating guilt and self inflicted punishment that is not necessary for life and is actually life suppressing. So I think the idea is more broadly, in order to worship Hadith, which is life, you have to be willing to try experiences that might not necessarily be considered conventional. And I think that is of course very much connected with the lust card, but I don't think that necessarily means that you should take any and all sorts of drugs um, just because you can, because of course drugs have a number of incredibly bad side effects. Whitney Houston being an example, her life, how much talent she had. And I know this is sort of a foolish topic to be talking about, but I can't help but feel it's in conjunction with it. I mean, what a gift she had, and how it was totally thrown away. And she might have experienced a lot of pleasure and happiness, however brief, from her dabbling. No, not dabbling, but her use of drugs and her abuse of drugs. But look what she threw under the bus. Uh, an incredible divine gift, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, of course, everyone has a talent, I believe, that they contribute to the world, and it could be very subtle. In her case, it was a big talent, in my opinion, anyway. I thought she had an incredible voice. Um, and how by falling into patterns of repeated behavior, we render ourselves defunct, and we are no longer able to carry out that divine purpose, or exercise our divine gift. And I think that's basically what I want to talk about when we get to the star and the sun. Um, but for now, getting back to lust, I think that's the big warning of this card, is that just because he renamed it lust does not mean that it can be taken quite so liberally, so as to excuse yourself of all potentially bad behavior, of all your addictions that might be in the category of lust. Um, because they're still debilitating, and they're still disrespectful of the Godhead that you have. But equally disrespectful is to completely stifle life. And I think that's, asceticism is also not the answer. Abstinence is not exactly the answer either. And I think the idea is that, the general doctrine of the card, or the path on the tree of life, um, is that life is about enjoyment. Creation is about enjoyment. And that the idea of the zeal of the Lord that, the prophets talk about, or as Isaiah talks about with Christ. He says that the Messiah, the zeal of the Lord of hosts shall be upon him. That sort of zeal is quasi-sexual, and is ecstatic, and is um, proud and destructive, and doesn't necessarily play nice. I think when eh, we tend to think of, particularly in Christianity, of the spiritual experience being totally about submission, and being about the ascetic experience, self-denial being the path towards religious experience. And I think the the reality is, if the God that you worship is the source and definition of life, and if life is motion and life is energy, then it can't be denial. God cannot be about denial. God can also not be about um, boredom. God cannot be about restriction. God cannot be about death in any way, in the sense of ignorance, in the sense of doing, in the sense of non-creation. Because of course God, Keter is life and death simultaneously. For I am life, but knowledge of me is also the knowledge of death, as Hadith says. So it is very much both, but the idea is that life, or the concept of life, really embodies both life in the flesh and death. That the two are the double curves of the same serpent, which is life with a capital L. And of course, serpent is the definition of the letter, or rather the translation for the letter of this card. Lust is the letter Tet, or Teth, and Teth, or Tet, means a serpent. And so, of course, this immediately gives us a lot of different connotations. The serpent in the Garden of Eden, in which case, for the Gnostics, it would be the serpent was actually considered a version and precursor of Christ, because the serpent is that which saved Adam and Eve from the sloth of ignorance, and gave them knowledge of their reality. So for the Gnostics, Satan of the Old Testament was not necessarily a bad guy, and it isn't until the New Testament where we see a shift. And since the Gnostics believed that the serpent in the Garden of Eden was really Christ, then it's in some ways the devil of the New Testament is a totally different thing, and for them represented ignorance, and just, I guess, yeah, just mostly the sloth of ignorance and the darkness of it, and of the ego. So we have that connotation, the idea of wisdom, with the serpent, but we also have the and the serpent of life in general that we just talked about. But we also have the serpent of the Kundalini, which is, of course, a kind of tantric, sexual-ish, primal energy and very divine energy that is supposedly contained at the base of the spine in the Muladhara chakra, which is the lowest chakra on the human spine. And this is the chakra associated with primal instincts, with sexual desire, the desire to procreate, but survival instincts, practical wisdom, but it's considered the lowest of all of them. And there are, the next chakra, the what is it, the spleen chakra, is actually more sexual than the Muladhara chakra. But the Muladhara chakra is because Crowley associated it actually with, not to get too graphic, but with the anus, actually. And so for him, that region of the body was considered a prime sexual center. So the Muladhara chakra does have this kind of, to put it politely, a kind of nitty-gritty sexuality to it, and I guess an unconventional pleasure aspect to it. Because of course Crowley was the big sexual experimenter, much to his social detriment. Even now, I mean, one of the big issues that people have with him, besides the fact that they think he was some raving lunatic Satanist, which is really not remotely accurate. It depends on your concept of the word Satanist. I mean, from his perspective, it had nothing to do with Anton LaVey's concept of Satanism. I mean, he didn't even really believe in an entity known as Satan, in the sense of, a pitchfork-wielding, evil-doing God who's quasi-God that's going to tempt you to do things that you shouldn't do. The idea is that sort of does exist, but is not necessarily quite so evil, and that there is no devil that is trying to trick you into making mistakes. But anywho, where was I going with this? So the card does have an aspect of sexual deviance, but I think that is on its lowest energy arc. I think lust, we have to remember that the lust card is, on the Tree of Life, it is the path that connects Chesed to Geburah. And so this is connecting mercy to power. And these are, of course, in the tree, they are the highest ideals below the abyss. So there is a loftiness to lust, and it's not on the lower part of the tree, and when we put the chakra system on the Tree of Life, the Muladhara chakra is in Malkut, which is on the bottom. And lust is not remotely connected with that Sephirah. So if we're talking about this card strictly Kabbalistically, it has almost nothing to do with literal, deviant sex. It can, but it's almost like that is more of a means to an end. The important aspect of this is the spiritual component of the passion aspect. It is the rapture of lust is not necessarily just about physical pleasure. Certainly it can in a reading, but in general, I think it is more a representation of the complete intense attraction between polar opposites in general. It is the Lover's card, or what was established in the Lover's card, the basically the disintegration into opposites. Because we have opposites, we have a polarity between them. We have a tension between them that inherently wants to be resolved. And this is what Nuit is saying in book one. For what is it? For the pain of separation is as nothing, and the joy of dissolution all. The idea is that that's the whole point of separate existence, that it is simply to generate pleasure and to create, because of course, as we talked about in the Lovers, you can't create something unless you have an idea of separation. And so in this card is a double connotation of creation, because of course lust being connected to the sexual act is about creation, and life being the serpent, but it is very much also about death. And he says that her cup, which is of course the Holy Grail supposedly, is brimming with death. And that would explain why it has that color, the bluish green color, which is the color of, what is it, death, or the 24th path in Atzilut or something. So it is related to the death card, and he does say that lust and death are the two strongest zodiacal trumps in the deck, but that lust is purer than death, and so therefore is slightly better. But that they both represent similar ideas. So of course with that comes the connotation of the orgasm with lust. But I think not only do you have the creation of something new in lust, but you also have the dissolution that Nui is talking about, the joy of dissolution, and the bliss of experiencing integration with something else other than yourself. But of course, if we, the idea is that separate monads cannot necessarily do that. That because we are each separate monadic beings, we each have a hadith to ourselves. I think the idea that we have to get at is that you can never really fully experience lust with anything other than yourself. On the highest spiritual arc of this card, that lust is the fusion or the sexual tension that exists between the soul and the spirit. It can also represent, though, the tension between the spirit and the body. The tension between the highest and the lowest aspect of the human being, and that both of these are so attracted to each other that eventually they must collide, so to speak, and create a third party, which is an individual, which is neither wholly one nor wholly the other. Wholly, not Holy. So it can represent that too. The other thing about this card is, it being Teth and the Serpent, it is also very much about channeling magical energy, and it is the number 11, which Crowley says is the number that represents the current of magic and magical power. So it does have a double-edged connotation as well, that it's a force that can be used for either good or bad, because it just represents raw energy and raw passion that is sort of intoxicated on its own ability. But it is a magical force. And so, of course, it does have many sex magic connotations. But I think, the other thing that it has to do with is the combination in magic of willpower and form. That when you are dealing with magic, or prayer is the same thing, really. Magic or ritual magic is very much a form of Western prayer, and I think this is something that people tend to overlook as its critics. Magic is not necessarily about conjuring voodoo what's-its, and of course that's a legitimate branch of religion to some people too. I'm just being stereotypical here, and I don't mean to offend anyone. But that sort of like, all magicians conjure demons, all magicians are, making pacts with the devil. No, it really is so far removed from that. If anything, real ritual magic tends, if you go to Golden Dawn based stuff, has to do more with angelic forces, gods from various mythologies that represent certain natural forces in the universe. So first of all, if you happen to stumble on these videos and you think I'm some raving magic person, you have to know what magic is about. And in magic, it is about the combination of willpower with the desired result. But I think, of course, the Book of the Law, again, this card is heavily philosophical in regards to the Book of the Law based on the imagery. It is a fire card. The Aeon is a fire Aeon. So it has a lot of sympathy with these ideals. But, the Book of the Law also tells us that, what is it? For pure will, unassuaged of purpose, is altogether perfect. That if you really want to do something and you really want to do it well, then you can't be concerned for a specific result. You can't have a specific result in mind before you go about it. You just have to pour this sort of unrestricted willpower into it. And that is the release of real potent, magical power. In other words, the ability to create change in conformity with the will. So of course any act, every single act you do is a magical act. The amount of magical power it has is based on the amount of force you put behind it. And what effect it has is based on whether or not the laws of nature want to agree with you, or if you're forcing it to do something that it doesn't want to do already. And this is of course connected to true will, because true will is the path of what magic is appropriate for an individual and what magic is not, what acts are right and wrong, or better or less desirable, because of course the idea is that there is no real right and wrong on a high level. But anywho, so the attraction there becomes about not so much form, but the idea of the body of space on which you are acting. This card represents the tension between Nuit and Hadit, and Nuit is a concept of the individual's will, and particularly the individual's magical will as a divine being, because a god is synonymous with its will and its own power. Chokmah is a direct emanation of Keter, Chokmah being God's infinite willpower and strength and energy. So it's the same thing we're dealing with here. And Nuit is the body of, I suppose, to use a sort of dated Einsteinian term, the space-time continuum, so to speak, which I believe was recently disproven. But the idea of the body of space in general, the field of action in which your specific action is going to take effect, that the tension between that body of potential and your action as just by choosing to do something, but in this case as the magical act with all this force behind it, that there's a sexual tension there, that when you are performing magic or when you are really performing any action, you are making, hypothetically, making love to the universe, that you are making a sexual act with the world around you, that every single action you do is a sexual act with God. And that in that light, this is how we see the universe as pure joy, for the sorrows are but shadows and doth pass away, because the universe is constantly in one endless state of orgasm. And that's kind of what I think the Lust card is really getting at. That any action, any event is the result of the meeting of some current of energy with a field of potential, and that the attraction between those is the source of lust, and is intense. That isn't going to be passive. Creation cannot be a passive act. Creation cannot be an ascetic act. It has to be, it's going to have this kind of proud quality to it, because the card is also Leo. And it is wanton as well. Creation is wanton. I mean, creation does not have any, creation has so little restrictions upon it. I mean, of course there are I think general laws that keep things in place, obviously. Um, and this might be getting to its connection with Geburah to some extent, but on a very obscure level. But I think obviously things die off, species die off. But I mean, the dinosaurs are totally an impractical group of creatures. I mean, totally impractical, and they clearly contributed very little to the world other than their fossils, which provide us with fuel. Um, but it's not like they did much to really manifest God on Earth, which is what makes man supposedly special. Um, so the idea is that creation is not very partial. Um, creation is very random and kind of happens at will. And this is talking about the spontaneity of life. And so, of course, it is totally valid to say that the universe is like the Whore of Babylon. It is not necessarily synonymous with the Whore of Babylon, and the individual is not necessarily synonymous with the Great Beast or the Antichrist, which is the other connotation of this card. But you can easily make that jump if you just take them as symbols. The idea is very much about the individual and the world around them, that the world around you is on some level willing to entertain any possibility, but because of the various, I think, because of the various wills at work, and because of the various, I guess, institutions already in place in the universe, certain things are more possible than others, obviously. And so she, as much as she may be attracted, she, in the allegorical sense, the universe may be attracted to a potential, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. But the fact that she is open to all of those things, and because she is affected on by every individual will has an effect on the universe around them. And so it is like a whore or a prostitute. And of course, those are very loaded words and seem kind of degrading, but in this case she's holy because of that. She isn't seen as wrong or amoral or evil because of those things. She's seen as beautiful, and she's seen as fertile. She's seen for what she is. you know she's seen as in a good way for these things, and the individual as the beast is about, you know, the action done here, especially if it is the magical act, is self-serving. You know, even if it is for the precipitation of one's true will. True will is self-serving. I mean, every action you do that comes from a pure place that has an amount of lust behind it is self-serving to a large extent. And this really calls into question altruism and the real aspect of what altruism is about. And I think that's sort of what we get at with the Hanged Man. And I'm not saying that all altruism is wrong. It's just that it is not necessarily as genuine an act. If Thelema is all about being genuine with yourself and others, altruism is not necessarily embedded in the most basic aspect of individuals. I mean, we, being used to living in society, of course, want to help other people, and of course, we all experience a level of sympathy, and we all have empathy. And so again, it is not wrong to help people. It's not what I'm saying. But the idea is that the individual as a god, um, altruism is not necessarily, or rather self-sacrifice in any way, is not necessarily valid or feasible. From that perspective, every action is for self-perpetuation. I don't know. I mean, this is a very confusing card. There is so much to it. Um, and it is an incredibly fascinating card. Um, it is also a very potent card. But again, I do think it's wildly misunderstood because it does encapsulate so much of what Crowley was getting at with Thelema. And I think a lot of these words and terms he used simply to weed out people that wouldn't be able to embrace a very liberal doctrine. If you cannot make the leap that the Book of Revelations, for instance, is allegorical, and in Crowley's interpretation was a vision that was interpreted poorly, basically, by people who were afraid of the liberal era that we live in now. They characterized it in a way that was in obviously a negative light, but that it itself necessarily was not necessarily negative. Um, so by using these terms, he is effectively jarring you out of your complacency of just accepting these stories as perfectly true and literally true. But he's also weeding through people, the people who are going to just take all that stuff for granted and immediately look at these images and texts and say that right off the bat that there's nothing good to them because of that, when there is a lot that is true and valid to these teachings and to this deck and to what he wrote. And I know there are obviously things about Crowley that I cannot condone, nor do I wish to or choose to. His drug addiction and his apologetics for his drug addiction, I think, are disgraceful, frankly. And in that case, he really flubbed. His anti-Semitism, he really flubbed. I mean, that was just, his whole anti-Semitism is also inexcusable. Um, but uh, but there are a lot of things that he's good for as well. And I know I will always be perpetually grateful for his making this deck because it has changed my life. So, anywho, I hope you didn't find this too confusing, that it was fairly on topic, and that it gave you some new perspectives on this card. Um, all right, and thank you for watching. Please like it if you did. And I will see you in the next video for a card that is the complete opposite, the Hanged Man. Bye now.